All righty. Welcome, and thank you everybody today for joining us for our session, Frequently Asked Questions on Understanding Clinical Trials and What Every Patient Should Know. My name is Dr. Christopher Pena, and I'm the Director of Educational Programs at the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. And today, really excited to have Dr. David Avigan and Ms. Caitlin Smith from the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, Massachusetts, and Peter DeToro, who is a myeloma patient from Boston. So a couple of weeks ago, the MMRF had a webinar on understanding clinical trials. And today's live stream is going to be a continuation of that discussion. We got a lot of questions during it, so we'd love to help answer them during this time. So if you're interested in that particular webinar, you can find a link to recording on our educational resource hub at our website. That's the mmrf.org. And if you have any questions on clinical trials or just questions in general that we don't get to today, you can also contact our Patient Navigation Center. The number's in the chat right here. That's 1-888-841-6673. So definitely encourage you to use that resource. It's a great resource, especially when understanding more details about clinical trials, eligibility, and all those important things. So with all that said, we'll be getting questions in the chat. We have our own set of questions that we'll go over here. And I'm excited to get started. So I think the first thing we'll kick off with is really kind of getting to the nuance of what a clinical trial is. So in terms of process, I should say. So my first question is for Dr. Avigan. Can you start explaining just what is a clinical trial?
Sure, Chris. And, this is such an important question, I know, for many of our patients. So the standard of care in any discipline, and thinking about multiple myeloma, really comes from the experience we have in trying new therapies and understanding what the right sequence of those treatments are, what are the right combinations. And really the only way that we get to that understanding is through the performance of clinical trials. This is basically where patients who are, very, in this way, generous and often devoted to the field, in addition to, of course, their own situation, will come forward to try what could be a new treatment, and that certain types of trials involve the very first introduction of a new therapy into patients, or they may be more later phase trials where we're trying to get a better sense of what the overall response rate is by looking at a larger group of patients, or ultimately what may be a randomized trial, which may be a multi-center national study where patients from all over the country or even internationally are being given one of two types of treatments or other, even more than that, to sort of ask the question, how does this newer therapy compare to an older one? How does this particular combination compare to an older one? And the questions that we typically ask are about safety. Are there side effects that we need to understand, specific toxicities that are relevant that we learn about, and really to color that in? Sometimes we have a sense of what that might be from the preclinical work that is being done, but until you're actually treating patients, you don't know. And a lot of the work that's done by a clinical trial team is to understand what side effects are we seeing? Is this maybe related? Is it not related? Is it something unexpected? And then the other major piece is, what's the therapeutic effect and how helpful is it? Does it improve response rates? And how does that compare to a standard of care that already exists? So those are really the critical questions we ask. And as people in this field know and patients have experienced, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of treatments that we have, most recently in the immune therapies, that we didn't used to have in our sort of armamentarium, that have purely come from this experience with clinical trials that we've had.
That's a great answer. And Caitlin, I think I wanted to just follow up because Dr. Avigan had mentioned early and late phase. So from a patient point of view, Caitlin, what are the different phases of a clinical trial? And we've gotten a lot of questions about, is that significant for patients? So if a patient is, say, searching for a clinical trial online or using some kind of tool, and they say, hey, this is a phase 1, or hey, this one's a phase 3, is this something they need to pay attention to? And what would be relevant for them?
I think yes, and I think it's important to, have the open conversation with the care team as well to kind of help guide those questions in that conversation. Usually in the phase 1 studies, they're often smaller, kind of focusing on safety, if, a brand new drug is safe for use. And then, later studies are looking more at how that drug can compare to other current treatments that we have. I think it also depends on kind of where a patient is at, in their treatment course, what might be an option for them. But I would just encourage patients to, have an open dialogue with their care team to see what might be a good fit.
Got it. And one of the words that's always popping up is double-blinded study, open label. So can you tell us what double-blinded means and what open label means?
Yeah, so in a double-blinded study, both the patient, the participants, and the entire research team, so the provider, nurses, both sides kind of don't know who is getting an investigational treatment versus who is getting a placebo or the control arm, where in, an open label study, the patients know what they're getting, the investigators know what they're getting, and they're able to kind of be upfront about the treatment there.
Got it. And so, Dr. Avigan, just kind of going back to this idea about patients looking at clinical trials and evaluating them, one thing being brought up is, in these early phase trials, there's a smaller number of patients. Later phase, there's a bigger number of patients. Is that something that patients themselves should be concerned about, just the number of patients within the clinical trial?
Sure. I mean, I think as Caitlin sort of said, that this is a very individualized decision that should be thought about carefully between a patient and their care team. The broad principles are that earlier phase studies, like a phase 1 study, may be studying something that is a first-in-human type of medication, and you're trying to understand its safety. Of course, you're also looking at whether there's evidence of efficacy. And a patient, for instance, may turn to that if they've gone through a lot of the standard treatments and don't have an easy standard of care option. That might be one reason. Or they may be a phase 1 trial of a new drug that is quite similar to other drugs that we already have experience with, but maybe have a certain change or a certain nuance that's put in. And that may be less of a unknown in terms of you're going into something that there's been no experience with, and that's an opportunity maybe to enhance response or do something that may have less toxicity. So I think even within the phase 1 trial group, there are ones that are really new that we don't have a lot of experience with, and ones that are similar to things that we have experience with. I think there's also a little bit of philosophy. Some patients want to be the first in the pool and are excited to kind of try something that's very new. And others, I think, have a sense of caution that before they jump into something, they want to have a sense that what's been the experience so far, and have the larger number of people already tried that. And I think that there's no right or wrong to that. That can be a sense of personal preference, but it does tie a little bit into their situation with their disease. If the disease is in a place where things are quiet or there are many other options, their tolerance for risk or doing something new might be different than if things are in a tougher place and they're sort of looking towards novelty because the standards aren't doing what it needs to. So I think there's really a lot of different things that go into this choice, and it's a very important and personal conversation with their care team to make sure that the right decision is being made.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point about having that conversation and about thinking about some of these therapies and how, if they are different from the standard of care, the patients need. And, are they running into a situation where they're running out of options versus are they doing quite well on the existing treatment? So again, I think it all ties back to that conversation and seeing where the patient.
And just to add one piece, that some trials are really using drugs that we are quite familiar with and have a lot of experience. And the question is, what's the right sequence, or is there an advantage putting two drugs that have a long track record or might even be completely approved, but putting them together? And so that question has in some ways less risk, if you want to say, about something new than if you were asking about a drug that is new to the market or hasn't had experience. So that's also some of these trials are really trying to address. We have a lot of great drugs. What's the right order to put them in? There may be unique toxicities when you do something earlier versus late. An example of that is in some of the immune therapies. There's been a question about whether earlier use may result in a better, response, or it may also change a bit the toxicities that we see. So those are not that it's an unfamiliar drug, but the setting is new.
Got it. And just as a follow-up to that, Caitlin, if we are looking at something that is a more, let's say, a treatment that's used in a later line, and we're bringing it up a little bit early, just so that patients listening in have a sense of like the care that goes along with it. So managing those unique side effects, is there a process in place within these clinical trials if there is a treatment like that?
Absolutely. I think, as Dr. Avigan said, a lot of these treatments we know, so we're able to kind of help predict side effects in a way, and help guide patients through, what might happen, and how we best manage toxicities. And, the clinical trials that are investigating these drugs are great in helping us as providers be able to manage side effects and kind of know what to do in those certain situations.
Got it. And one question that we're always getting, because we talk a lot about clinical trials, whether it's the actual process itself or we're talking about findings from conferences. I know ASH is coming up soon. And one word that we use a lot is real world study. So Dr. Avigan, can you clarify what a clinical trial is and a real world study is?
It's a great question. And of course, clinical trials do take place in the real world. But what tends to sometimes happen is that when a study is being first, particularly an earlier phase study, there's a lot of very kind of careful thought into the eligibility. There's an effort to try to make sure that patients that are more likely to have side effects or might be a little bit more frail are sometimes not included in the cohort of that group of patients. So there's always a question that when you see a certain effect, either how well people tolerate something or how high the response rate is, does that correlate to when the eligibility is really opened up to a larger group of people? The so-called real world really just means a less restrictive sort of population. An example in myeloma is sometimes there may be very strict rules about how good somebody's kidney function needs to be. But in the real world with myeloma, there are patients who have some compromise in their kidney function. And so the question is, well, do things change when you open it up in that way? So I think those studies, the real world studies, often tend to be either prospective studies where they just loosen those restrictions, or they may be even retrospective studies where they look at outcomes for a larger group of people across different centers where there wasn't restrictive or any kind of like major exclusionary issues around the eligibility. I think so those are very helpful. One of the interesting things, for instance, with CAR T cells is that they found that the real world data was actually quite similar to the data that was coming from those earlier studies. And that was a very reassuring thing, that we weren't somehow getting a false answer by being more restrictive.
Got it. And I think that's a really good segue to our next part about eligibility criteria. And we'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to hear from Peter. Really, Peter, you've been in a clinical trial yourself. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your myeloma history and how you ended up in a clinical trial.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Avigan. As I like to say every 3 months when we meet, in April of 2014, I had, symptoms of a bad back, and I thought I had slipped a disc. Went to see my PCP, who sent me out for an MRI, and the news was not reassuring. Within a few weeks, it was act now. So there was quite a bit of urgency to finding a set of treatments. I was fairly well advanced. Would you agree with that, Dr. Avigan? That I was, yeah.
Sure.
So the question really became, we live in Boston. Boston has some of the best, has the best medical care systems in the world. How do you interject yourself into that system in the most effective way? How do you find the expert? How do you get on the expert's patient list? And I am a believer in, you don't believe in science. Science creates data that proves that you're moving in the right direction. You believe in other things. I knew that there were trials going on. I was interested in trials right from the beginning. I researched it. I knew what the standard of care was. I knew I'd be going through that. I wanted a chance for more. We found Dr. Avigan, our PCP, knew that there was a guy at Beth Israel, and his name began with A. That's enough for Google to surface the Dr. David Avigan. Proceeded to petition, can I get into one of your trials? Because it was, you could surface the information on the web. He had a 3rd stage trial, which means that they've already figured out that the immunotherapy doesn't kill you. They've already done stage 2, and that winnows it out. It looks like it has a positive effect. And in stage 3, they're expanding that to be able to zero in on the efficacy. And I wanted in that process. So that was 11 years ago. I spent Thanksgiving of 2014 at Beth Israel, not eating much turkey after my autologous stem cell transplant. And in January, I had the first vaccine. I then went on to a second. And if you want more detail, I would of course pass the mic to Dr. Avigan. At that time, it was a dendritic cell fusion vaccine trial. I think that process from a very high level is very similar to CAR T. You're attempting to get the patient's own immune system to cease to recognize the cancer as self. If your immune system thinks that or reacts to the cancer cells as self, it won't kill them. To make them not self so that they will attack seems to be the goal of the vaccine approaches. And I wanted that. Here I am 11 years later, and I'm very grateful to Beth Israel and to David Avigan for, 10 years of fun, being alive, finishing my career, retiring, and enjoying the company of my wife and my kids.
That's terrific. That's really great news. And for people listening in, I think that they're going to want to know, a little bit more about that process. And so just kind of pivoting a little bit about what that looks like in terms of getting involved in those steps to getting into the clinical trial. So Caitlin, how do you determine who is a good candidate for clinical trial? And can you explain what informed consent is?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of who's a good fit, I think it's kind of twofold. So one is, medically, is the patient a good fit for the trial in terms of inclusion and exclusion criteria? With inclusion criteria focusing on, things a patient must have to join a study. So they must have myeloma. It must be at a certain phase of the disease. Sometimes they must have had, certain prior lines of therapy before joining. And then things that may make a patient not a good fit would be certain medical conditions, certain medications that they're getting, maybe because we don't know how they interact with the treatments that we're giving. I also think that it's a personal decision too. So does it fit with the patient's lifestyle? Does it, the schedule needing to come in, does all of that align with what the patient wants and what their kind of wishes are? In terms of informed consent, it's a process where we want to ensure that the patient fully understands what the clinical trial and the study entails of before joining. So it, explains the purpose of the study. It explains risks of the study, side effects, potential benefits, different alternatives. We want the patient to feel fully informed with everything that they are choosing to go forward with before they make that choice. And I think we always, make sure patients know too that, just because they're signing informed consent right now doesn't tie them to this treatment forever. They can choose to stop at any time. And that's, fully their choice to do so.
Got it. And I know we had a question in the chat about if someone signs up for a clinical trial, how long it lasts. So they can leave at any time, but are there other points in which it concludes?
Yes, and it depends. So, I think some of the clinical trials will have a set duration of, 2 years of the treatment. And then after that time point, some trials will, allow the patients to receive the treatment standard of care or through different mechanisms. Some of the studies also will, try to follow the patients for several years after to see how they're doing, look at their overall survival and see how they're feeling in that sense.
Got it. And Dr. Avigan, can you describe for when a patient, what they can excuse me, can you describe what a patient can expect being in a clinical trial? So for example, will they have more lab visits or procedures than those who aren't in a clinical trial? How does that go for them?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. And I know that that's, of course, part of the calculus and equation for any patient to understand, what's involved in signing up for this and how much extra, so to speak, does it require, whether it's visits or certain kinds of tests. Each study is different. There are some studies that are, by their design, they try to be fairly easy in terms of having a somewhat lighter touch on the patient. Often studies, for instance, about drugs that are approved where you're trying to ask a very specific question about sequence may not have as many sort of tests as a very early phase study where you're really trying to learn as much as you can about a new drug and what its potential side effects are. Some studies, and including the one that Peter was part of, have a lot of very important scientific correlates that are part of it that have to do with trying not just to understand whether patients respond or not, but why, and are there aspects of, let's say, the immune system that we can understand better through certain kind of what we call translational studies. And that usually means some extra blood work or other tests that may give sort of information that's not going to a standard lab, but going to a research lab that's going to be doing some extra work on that. And I think some patients find that kind of cool and gratifying and want to be part of that. And other patients are thinking like, this is hard enough. I don't want anything extra at all. So I do think when we talk to patients about trials and opportunities, as Caitlin was saying, you want to be very individual and first of all, make patients feel like it's a completely option that's may have excitement or positive aspects, but is not a requirement, and that it has to fit their story. So I would say in general, a trial does involve a little bit more in terms of close follow-up, some monitoring that may be increased, some questions that may be a little bit different. With that, the good is that, you're following people a little bit in a more kind of sometimes structured way, and that there's some good that can come with that. And some patients actually really enjoy that and enjoy being part of the learning process that's going to affect patients themselves, but also the wider community.
And Peter, I want to kick some of this over to you because as Dr. Avigan was saying, there may be some more measurements, some more things that are involved with the clinical trial. And so that, of course, from the patient point of view, may be a schedule or something along those lines where you're having to do that. So I know it's been a while, but can you describe what your study visits were like and how was that schedule manageable for you?
Well, and at that point in time, I was still working. I was 66. Multiple myeloma and its treatment, the standard of care treatment, is kind of demanding. While I didn't check out of my job, I was able to keep working via this technology, via work from home. Sometimes I was not willing to turn on the camera, because I was having a bad day. I wasn't looking too good. I was just committed to it. I needed to go in. I needed to be tested. I wanted to be part of solving the problem. And the way you solve the problem of human disease, specifically multiple myeloma, is science. I'm not into waving the rubber chicken. I was a computer guy. Waving the rubber chicken around the computer sometimes works. It doesn't work in science. So please, take my blood, please. If it can help somebody else, it certainly helped me. I'm still here. If it can help somebody else, that's a goodness. And that was my attitude then, remains now. Sometimes, heading into Beth Israel for, various procedures, becomes arduous. I live in Marshfield. That's in Boston. You might as well be the other side of the world on some days, but it's worth it. It's worth it. The treatment is high quality, and I don't know if I'm still alive because of, the vaccine, the dendritic cell fusion vaccine. Excuse me. Perhaps, but at least I'm contributing to the next generation of understanding. So take my blood, please.
Got it. And Caitlin, just to kind of pivot a question to you. So Peter was saying how this is science, and of course science requires publication, it requires data, and so sometimes we get patients who are a little bit concerned about their health information. And so I guess my question to you is, how is the patient's health information kept private when they're in a clinical trial?
Yeah, so that's definitely something that's very important, right? And I think something a lot of patients worry about. Every patient in a clinical trial is essentially assigned a study ID or a study number. So a way to de-identify them from those outside of, their facilities. So anyone outside of Beth Israel, this patient is referred to as XYZ, not their name, not their birthday, not their medical record. So an important way of keeping data safe. And then there are always, certain processes with our databases and all of that to ensure that everything is kept very secure.
Got it. And I think one thing that this touches on, so we talk about this study ID number, but just more broadly, in terms of the clinical trial process, that's something you're assigned, and you do see your specialist. But I think overall, for anybody wanting to know, what are the touch points along the clinical trial? So who are they seeing when they're doing this? Is it Dr. Avigan? Is it you? Is it somebody else? Is there a study coordinator? Can you kind of give an overview of the team, so to speak, for clinical trials and how the patients interact with people on that team?
So the team is definitely very broad. So every patient is usually assigned to a research nurse who is super familiar with the trial, really knows the ins and outs completely, along with a study coordinator who really helps ensure that visits are planned and go smoothly, ensures that we're following all the necessary testing that the protocol relies on. So those are kind of two key players that patients become familiar with, in addition to, the standard of care team being Dr. Avigan and myself.
Thanks for sharing. I think I'm going to pivot a little bit here and talk more about clinical trial eligibility. And so, Dr. Avigan, what about patients who are already on treatment and they're responding to therapy, or maybe they've gone into remission or they've reached MRD negativity? Are they also appropriate candidates for a clinical trial?
The question, is a very important one, and it really depends on the very specific situation of a patient and what kind of treatments are then potentially available to them. So there are, for instance, therapies that are geared towards patients who are in response, and we're trying to see, can we move them to from a partial to complete response, or if they're persistently MRD positive, can they be put into an MRD negative state? So those are often almost cleanup type of medicines that you're trying to see, can we not take somebody who has disease and initially start a response. We're asking, can you take somebody who's already responded and improve on it, or maybe create a longer duration of remission? There are, of course, other studies that are more about, can we get the initial response going, or can we do something that will give us insight into a new treatment we haven't had experience with before. So there's a whole gamut of what might be appropriate. And honestly, from a patient perspective, some of that may be more meaningful than others. I think it's pretty straightforward to say that a patient who doesn't have a great option and has a very promising clinical trial option, that's maybe very compelling. But thankfully in myeloma, we're in a setting where there are many good treatments. And so the idea of when is a trial the right thing, when is it addressing a question that's going to be meaningful to that patient, is very individualized and something that we talk through carefully. And of course, changes a little bit as the clinical trial menu changes. There are times when trials are more common in a particular setting than others.
Got it. And what if, going to inclusion and exclusion criteria, what if a patient is excluded just because of a current medication they're on? So in our last webinar, we did get a question about somebody taking a drug that lowers blood counts, and that alone made them ineligible for that trial. As a provider, would you ever consider adjusting or holding that medication or doing some type of behavioral change to help them align with that criteria, or how does that whole process work?
Yeah, I mean, we're always, I hope, our North Star is always what is going to be best for the patient, what is going to meet their needs, what's going to help them in the life that they, want to lead and preserve the things that are important to them. And so a therapy that somebody's on, for instance, that's contraindicated if someone is part of a trial, that is easily replaced by another option or that may not be fully needed. That is straightforward to say, well, if the trial is going to be really helpful and the patient's very interested, we can make adjustments and figure that out. Conversely, if it's a therapy that's really important and it wouldn't be the right thing or safe for them to come off of it, then we don't want to bend that or have anything compromise that just so that they can go on a study. And often if patients are interested in a study, there may be more than one option. And so one might be a better fit for them because of those kinds of issues. So again, it's the exclusion criteria are really not meant to be barriers or to be sort of points of frustration. They're meant to be, who are the right people to try this therapy in a safe way, and where would the benefits or risks kind of be balanced if somebody was in this situation versus not. So I think that the hope would be that, for the question you asked, is that it would really just depend on whether that therapy is really needed and what the other options are.
Got it. And just to follow up with that, thinking about unmet needs, so patients with oligosaccharidosis multiple myeloma or EMD, are there options for those patients too? And Caitlin, I'd invite you to weigh into how can they find those kinds of options? Because we do get patients that it isn't their standard multiple myeloma. There are these other parts to it that make it a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, I can start and Caitlin can jump in as well. It's a great question. A lot of times the trials are built around quantifying response based on M protein or serum free light chain. And it is true that sometimes as patients move a little farther into their disease, the proteins become less reliable or we don't always see them elevated. Or patients with extramedullary disease, meaning sites outside the blood or marrow, can have a bit of a different course or sometimes they respond a bit differently. Historically, I think some trials excluded patients like that, not all of them, and there definitely are trials, particularly if they're geared towards more later stage disease, that it would be silly to exclude those patients because that's who the patients are. And so I think that there is hopefully some understanding to not be restrictive in that way if that's the patient population you're interested in. But it is true that those things can sometimes be a barrier. And, when Caitlin and I are looking for options for a patient, we will often say, well, we have a trial that, does exclude patients in a certain category, but this other one doesn't. And so if we're going to talk to them about an option, that would be the one we would at least hopefully have open to them if they're interested.
And Caitlin, how would they go about just trying to find those?
So I think, two things. We, of course, always encourage patients if they, are finding things on their own, bring it to us, start the conversation. And there's lots of different resources online that patients can use to help find trials that are open in their areas. And then again, as Dr. Avigan said, if, we have a trial open or a trial we think might be a good fit for a patient, we always are very forthcoming in creating the discussion with them and starting the conversation.
And we got a question from somebody listening. How does an extremely high-risk diagnosis affect a patient's ability to enroll in a clinical trial?
Is that, Chris, who do you want to tackle that one?
Oh, Dr. Avigan, go ahead, and Caitlin, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think that this is an evolving area. I think it's been well recognized that there is a subset of patients when particularly at early times in their treatment course, that have features that raise concerns about a disease that may be more resistant or less likely to respond to some of our standard treatments. In some ways, that is a group of patients where there is the greatest need, unmet need, to kind of really come up with novel approaches and new treatments to address high risk. And risk is defined in different ways, so that's also important for people to understand. When they use that phrase, what is it specifically referring to? But there are a lot of trials that are trying to address those questions, whether they are about use of immunotherapy or earlier. So, for instance, drugs like CAR T cells or bispecific T cell engagers, which have shown great efficacy in later stages of disease or after people have had prior treatments. There's a lot of investigation about whether they, what is their role in going early, and could they address better some of the higher risk things that, say, some other biologic therapies. And that may also be a space for novel drugs, in other words, drugs with new mechanisms. When the biologic therapies were first discovered, even back in the day, I'm embarrassed to say, but I was certainly practicing when Velcade and other of those drugs were first coming forward, they did seem to work better in some of the risk situations that chemo didn't. So there's already been an experience in myeloma that saying that something is high risk doesn't mean that it's high risk for everything. It means sometimes that it's high risk with the current regimens, but that just adds more importance in finding other paths forward.
Got it. And Caitlin, I think just in terms of the question being, how does an extremely high-risk diagnosis affect a patient's ability to enroll in a clinical trial? Do you see any difference? Or from those touch points that we discussed earlier, are there any changes with that? Or is it almost the same process? Or is there anything unique about that?
I think, a couple of the considerations may be enrolling on a trial sometimes takes time. So patients, often need to undergo certain lab work, certain testing to see if they're eligible. And I think sometimes in high risk disease, needing to make sure that the patient has that time to wait to enroll to the study is a really important factor.
Got it. And so I want to pivot and talk a little bit more about evaluating the success of the clinical trial. And we also got a question, I think, that relates very well to this. So, let's say a clinical trial is working out really well. Why does it take very long to approve, Dr. Avigan?
I think that there are different kinds of studies, but there is sensitivity to the fact that, time is precious. And if there are going to be new advances, we want to bring those to patients as soon as we can, and we want that to get approval and to move into a standard of care as soon as possible. But we want to balance that with making sure that we really understand a drug before we start giving it in a more broad way, and that there are times when early experiences with a medicine end up proving to be different when you watch over a little bit longer, or sometimes side effects that you didn't really think about and weren't seen at the very beginning kind of start to show up later, so that when you're trying to inform patients about the risks and benefits, you want to make sure that you're doing a good job and being complete about that. So I think that each trial will have its own rules about this. So as an example, a lot of studies will have stopping rules, which means that if there's no response seen after a certain number of patients, the trial will be stopped early. Or there's a side effect that starts to happen in a more pronounced way that we initially thought, and the drug is considered too toxic. We don't wait for the whole study to be completed. We actually stop early. On the other side of that, let's say a drug is way more promising than we even understood, and you start to see clear benefit emerging early. Sometimes studies are stopped early, and there's a discussion with the FDA, for instance, about how that kind of dynamic design may change where things go. So, it is a very complicated process, and the approval process is complicated, and like any complicated process, there's some bureaucracy. But I think the real sort of will is to try to do this properly, and to not be slower than we should, and to also not be faster than we should for the reasons said.
Got it. And I think just to expand a little bit more on that evaluation, we hear a lot about when we describe clinical trials, primary endpoints, secondary endpoints, quality of life endpoints. So can you describe what those are in terms of how they make it easy or difficult to evaluate that clinical trial?
Sure, it's a great question. So, you know, the primary endpoint is typically one that is the foundational or question that is, you know, that the study is organized around, and often has to do with a statistical design. So, if, for instance, you have a new drug that doesn't have any prior experience, the primary endpoint is typically one of safety. And so there's a statistical design that says if you treat 20 patients and there is a certain kind of problem, you have a high enough chance of seeing it. And on the other hand, if it appears safe, you have a good enough sort of number of patients that you can make that assessment and move on to the next phase that might be a larger study to get more information about how well it works. Of course, in any phase 1 study, you'll want to know how well it works. So if you have a drug that's incredibly safe, but does nothing, you'll pay attention to that, and that is considered a secondary endpoint, you know, the response rate or the impact on time to remission. And it's not that you are not paying attention. You, of course, are paying attention, but the design is not specifically around that question. Later or larger studies, the primary endpoint is going to need to be something like time in remission or response rate or, of course, importantly, survival. One of the things that we want to be sensitive to is that response rates by themselves don't matter that much if they don't correlate with the time of response. And the other thing you mentioned is the quality of life. There's a greater sensitivity that if we have a treatment that's really hard to take and makes people sick, and, you know, as Peter was talking about earlier, the importance of maintaining his day-to-day life. And so if we create all kinds of hardship and we get a little bit of a response and it doesn't last that long, that's not a great result, even though the response rate might look good. So I think there is a sense, particularly as studies move later, that we want to integrate the most important outcomes. And when it comes to approval for the FDA, they're often most interested in those fundamental things of remission time and survival, and not just did somebody respond well. One thing to mention is a lot of studies now are looking at MRD, or what's called minimal residual disease, because there's been interest can we look at surrogate markers that would early on tell us that this is going to lead to a long-term response, so that we're not waiting 5 years before we can report back on whether something was helpful or not. And that has been an active area of discussion with the FDA, with investigators, to try and figure out, are there ways in an earlier time point to capture that information.
Got it. Thanks for sharing that about MRD. And I know, especially in our next webinar, reviewing some of these research presentations at ASH, we'll talk a lot about that too. So that's really helpful information. So Peter, as Dr. Avigan was saying, you know, there are side effects that one must consider or patients may go through. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience after you got your vaccine in this clinical trial. Did you have any side effects, and how did you manage them? What was that process like for you?
There were side effects to the standard of care. Autologous stem cell transplant is not a generous or one casually undertaken procedure. So I had some side effects from those. I don't believe I had any side effects from the vaccine. At the site of injection, I had a reaction, but I don't. Dr. Avigan, did I ever complain about any side effects from the vaccine? I don't think so.
Yeah, I think again, everybody's experience is a little different, but I think you did not have anything major.
Yeah. So, I had the standard, recovery tests and experience, except mine worked out very well. And I hope that my participation in this study generated some data that will enable the team at Beth Israel and others to advance the cause. The cause being help us stay alive.
Well, no, it's good that you had such a positive experience with that. And just kind of thinking about, I know that this was a vaccine in your case, but other kinds of treatments. Caitlin, I wanted to ask you, if a patient is in a clinical trial and they are taking some kind of treatment, and the trial itself reaches an endpoint or otherwise it's over, do those patients still receive treatment, or is it automatically cut off from them? How does that work?
So it definitely depends, but I would say in most situations they don't just stop receiving treatment. A lot of the therapies, as we mentioned earlier, are standard of care drugs that we're giving in different combinations. So often the patients can continue to receive those therapies even after the trial ends, just outside of the research study. I think something that Dr. Avigan and I really try to make sure our patients know is that regardless of if they're in the study or not, we're still going to take care of them. So even though the study may end, their treatment and the care that they're getting won't.
Got it. No, that's very helpful information. I think this is a good jumping off point to the next session, which is just really before a patient even considers a clinical trial, what are some important considerations? So first off, I know my camera is doing a little something off, so I am still on camera, but it's not showing me. But anyways, to say, if that doesn't get resolved, no big deal. Caitlin, what would you recommend to the patients listening who are interested in participating in a clinical trial? Like, how should they approach their provider?
So I think just be proactive, have an open dialogue. We really try to create, a strong partnership with our patients where they feel comfortable bringing up anything and everything to us. So I would encourage patients to do the same with their providers and just ask questions and see, what might be a good fit for them.
Got it. And Dr. Avigan, I think this is an interesting follow-up here. Are providers more proactive in identifying trials, or is it more on the patient, or is it something that's kind of shared between providers and patients?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a fundamental way, all care should be a collaborative, process where people are having, as Caitlin said, an open dialogue about, both what the medical situation is, their priorities, the things they are that are near and dear to them, and then decision making around care is thought about in those contexts, even whether it's choosing between standard of care medicines. But I do think that at the end of the day, it is the responsibility of the care team to outline options for the patients. And so patients, are often very well educated and know all kinds of stuff. And we learn a ton from that discussion and things that they may even have heard about or come to us to ask about. And so that's great. And we love that. But it is still our responsibility to say, hey, here's some options, here's some trial options, here's standard of care options. Let's talk through this. And for that to be a very open and unburdened conversation. So I think the care team should be very, forthcoming about that. Now, there may be a situation where somebody's, let's say, being cared for in a community setting and they have a strong affiliation, for instance, with one of the centers that does more research, and they have collaborative relationships where a provider might say, I'm going to check in with my colleague to find out what trials might be appropriate or might be available for you. And so that's how patients often find out about it, through that kind of collaborative relationship. And the patients then also can be very helpful in talking to their provider to say, hey, I'm interested in knowing what those options are, or could you check in about that? So I think, the responsibility and can go in all directions, but it is the responsibility ultimately of the care team to provide that.
And so, Caitlin, Dr. Avigan just mentioned that idea about a major academic center versus a community oncology clinic and all of that. So while we're on that subject, let's say a patient is at a community oncology clinic and they're not close to a major research institution or anything along those lines. Are there any kind of resources available to them?
Definitely. I think both through, for example, so BI alone, we would always connect patients with social work or different navigators that may help if they need resources with transportation or lodging or expenses in that sense. And then sometimes the trials themselves will also offer reimbursement and different means for the patients to be able to come to us and get the treatment if that's what's necessary.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, this is another good plug-in for those listening in who may be new to the MMRF. We do have a patient navigation center, and towards the end of this live stream, we'll also paste that again in the chat. It's already been pasted, but we'll do it again. But that's also a very helpful resource to find out transportation, financial, or other kinds of resources available for patients if they're not close to a major academic center and what that means. And so there's definitely support available to you for those listening in as well. Caitlin, I think we talked a lot about joining a clinical trial and kind of getting everything leading up to it. But let's say when a patient is in a clinical trial, when should they consider, is there ever a circumstance where they should consider leaving it? And how should they bring that up to their provider?
I think patients may consider leaving a trial for many reasons. So one being side effects, which of course we monitor for and we're looking out for all the time, but we would encourage our patients to be open with us, tell us everything that's going on. We always say we want to know anything and everything. And it could be a discussion at that point, whether it's something that we feel like we can manage or whether, it's really something that's better suited coming off of the study, receiving a different treatment. And then also if their lifestyle changes, if, they're moving, they want to travel, different things like that, that make the study not a good fit for them. We would just encourage patients to be open with us, tell us what's going on so we can figure out a way that we can help.
And Dr. Avigan, what happens after a patient leaves a clinical trial, both in terms of just the data that's provided and just for them? Is there any continued follow-up, or is that essentially it for them?
Yeah, I mean, just to emphasize something that Caitlin said, our primary responsibility and our commitment and dedication is to our patient. And whether a trial is the right thing or not, whether that's a decision that we make together or they want to stay on standard of care, whether they are on a trial and now are moving off a trial, the relationship, the commitment, the way we take care of folks doesn't change. So I think that it is true that if a patient, for instance, lives in an area that's far away and they're coming into a center for a trial and then are going back to their primary care doctor, the primary oncologist, that there is some change in their, who's they're seeing every day. But we want to stay connected. We want the patients to know that we are committed to them. The trial is only about trying to help somebody. It's not bigger or smaller than that. The commitment and that connection doesn't change. And I would say, Peter brought up something very important that I think is really fundamental to how we think about studies. We are always hoping for breakthroughs and things that will fundamentally change how we approach treatment. And we've seen many of those in myeloma. But a lot of the improvements happen a bit over time. We learn something from a study, and that informs the next one, and we make a certain change about how we give a drug or what's the right combination. And so over time, we get to a much better place. And so this information, for instance, that we are learning even now about how the immune system works and how drugs like vaccines or CAR T cells or bispecifics interact with the immune system are going to make us better at then knowing how to schedule them and treat with them and combine them. And so it's not just that we look at a study as did it change everything or nothing. It's often really important steps along a path. And I just want to really say, how appreciative we are of the generosity of spirit of our, patients, because, I think the idea of going into a study is, of course, at the end of the day, what's good for an individual person, but it does also help that broader community. And I think that's something to really recognize and spend a moment expressing appreciation for.
That's a very excellent point. And I think everyone at the MMRF, as well as people conducting these trials, are very appreciative of patients taking their time and putting their trust into this, because there are a lot of great things that come from it. And just to elaborate off of that, a lot of times we're talking about treatment interventions for multiple myeloma, but I think one thing that we haven't really touched upon, but love to just get your comments on, Dr. Avigan, are just like studies that are really studying some of the supplemental things. So like managing side effects or maybe sleep or nutrition. Can you comment a little bit about those kinds of clinical studies as well, and equally their importance?
Yeah, I mean, of course, a patient's actual experience, which is not just, what their M protein is doing, but how they feel and how healthy they feel and their emotional sort of health and the freedom they have to travel. One of my great joys when I see Peter is I get to vicariously live through whatever recent place that he's come back from. I do think that those aspects of someone's actual day-to-day life, you mentioned sleep, those are all really important parts of what an actual experience is. And I will tell you that one of the things that we are blessed with in myeloma treatment is so many options. And so when we have a therapy that works well, that's not enough. It actually has to correlate with a good quality of life, a lack of interference in somebody's priorities, all of the things that are part of that larger picture. And so studying that, knowing, for instance, what is the infection rate later on, what are some of the late side effects for some of these medicines, are going to be a major determinant of like what order to put them in. And drugs that are better tolerated and have better quality of life may come first.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I know that we're running up on time a little bit, and I think this is a great way to conclude this. So Peter, I want to start with you first. We've talked a lot about clinical trials and what they're about, what it entail and everything. Just for those listening in, can you list one myth that maybe some people may have about clinical trials that you would want to address, I would say?
I would think, I don't do much myth. I went for the clinical trial because I believed it was the fastest way to get to the most cutting edge treatment for my multiple myeloma. I had plans that did not include dying. So if there's a myth that when I talk to people about my experience, is it, are you getting something that is not properly thought through? Isn't it scary to get something that's not proven? Well, no, because the people that I met, entering into my experience, thought it through very well. They put me through the mill in terms of testing my ability, to breathe and, the strength of my body, which was still pretty good, to make sure I was a good fit. There was a lot of due diligence on the part of the Beth Israel team to make sure I could fit in and not, and benefit rather than get hurt. So make sure, if you're worried about getting something that is, you're going to get something that's not proven. That's what a clinical trial is about, but it will have been well thought out and safeguards are in place, and due diligence is practiced by the trial authors and the people who work for them. Put skepticism or fear aside when you're trying to figure out if participation in a clinical trial is appropriate for you. Approach it logically, examine it, listen to the people who know what they're talking about, pick people who know what they're talking about. That's very important.
That's excellent advice. And Caitlin, what advice do you have for patients who may be on the fence about clinical trials?
I think just, don't stop asking questions. Continue to ask the team any questions, any reservations that there might be about it. We always encourage our patients whenever we bring up a clinical trial to them that, they're never deciding that day. We want them to really take time, think about it, talk it over with, their families, the ones who are there for them to make sure it's the right fit, but really make sure that it's just an open discussion with the care team.
Excellent advice. And Dr. Avigan, I know that's two tough answers to follow there, but do you have any last advice for patients for clinical trials?
I think Peter and Caitlin said it perfectly. I mean, at the end of the day, there's no right or wrong to this. We're really just trying to explore what's going to be best for an individual person, what meets their needs, what meets their both medical needs as well as their, what resonates for them in terms of what's meaningful. And so I think that trials are very important for the field. They help to move us forward. They've brought, to us many of the therapies that we now lean on and rely on to really extend and have made really a magical effect in patients with myeloma in terms of really improving outcomes. And whether that is an individually right thing for an individual patient to pursue is just really all about the conversation that Caitlin outlined.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank the three of you for hopping on. I think this has been really helpful, really informative for people listening in. So just thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. I'd also like to thank everybody for listening in. On behalf of the MMRF, it's been really great having this live stream. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, AbbVie, Adaptive, Alexion, Bristol Myers Squibb, Cure, Genentech, GSK, TBD Sun, Kite, Arcellx, Legend Biotech, Pfizer, Regeneron, and Sanofi for sponsoring this session, as well as support that we get from an educational grant from Janssen Biotech Incorporated, which is administered by Janssen Scientific Affairs, LLC. If you have any questions about what we discussed today, please feel free to contact our Patient Navigation Center. The number is 1-888-841-6673. I know we've shared the link in the chat a couple of times, so you can also find it there too. But thank you all for participating, and I think this has been really great. I hope everybody has a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you.